First of all, I will say a few words about you, Mariana, and if you want to add anything, please feel free. You are experienced and passionate Montessorian. You have over a decade of work in Montessori classrooms. You are a former Montessori school leader. You have supported, I would say, thousands families with group and one-on-one support through the Peace program that you lead. You also wrote an award-winning book, Babies Build Toddlers. And you have been a speaker at one of our conferences for a very long time, and we always have really good feedback for your talks. So, again, I'm really glad you are here, and I really appreciate that you have made the time to come today.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. We've been working together doing these talks for years now. So I'm really excited to be here and be here with all of you. I would love to know, as Lucy mentioned in the chat, to just say if you're here as an educator, if you're here as a parent, and if you are here as a parent, the age of the child that you are parenting or children, that would be really helpful. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a presentation first, and then we can go through scenario-based questions. You can ask questions about the content, but I always find that it's helpful to walk families through the scenarios that they're currently dealing with. So whatever happened this morning, let's talk about it from the perspective of order, because that's what we're talking about today.
And we see your presentation.
Okay, wonderful.
Oh.
So welcome, everyone. We are talking about the role of order and why predictability is crucial for toddlers. And my name is Mariana. I am an AMI 0 to 6 Montessori trained educator. I am a Montessori administrator and a Montessori coach. So I do instructional coaching and parent education coaching. I'm an author and I'm a mom of two living on Lashana Loney land. So I run the Peace program where I do one-on-one and group coaching with parents and educators. I have an online courses, a podcast, workshops, and a conference. And I do that all with my international team of Montessori educators. We together make up the Peace team where we put on our podcasts, we do our conferences, and we do workshops for the Montessori community. And I am the author of the book Babies Build Toddlers, which is a Montessori guide to parenting the first 18 months. It's designed to be a visual guide that anchors you in the child's development first and foremost, because as Montessorians, that's what our first question is going to be, is what is the child's development, not what do we do about it? So we first want to anchor ourselves in the development, and that's what my book does. And so today we're talking about the role of order, and we're wondering why predictability is so crucial for this particular age group. So what we're going to do is we're going to understand a bit about the development of this age group. We're going to do some work to understand order. Then we're going to use an example to understand how the Montessori method is applied when you understand development and order, with the example of the wrong cup, the child melting down if you didn't give them the right color cup for their water. And then we'll talk about some key strategies for implementing order. And of course, we'll end with our Q&A. So starting with understanding development. So the big question when we think about development is we're wondering, how do we go from a newborn who is not in charge of their faculties? They have immature digestion, immature eyesight, immature sleep. They do not have voluntary coordinated movement. They don't have a language. They have none of these basic capacities. And then by 6 years old, they've constructed all of those capacities. So by 6 years old, you have a child who's walking and talking and understanding most of social life and can meet most of their basic needs. So how do we go from one to another? The transition point of this basic development is going to be at 3 years old. So you're going to have this period from 0 to 3, and then a separate period in development from 3 to 6. And from the 0 to 3 period, that's going to be a constructive period. So this is when the child is, for example, in language, the child is going from no language as a newborn to speaking in sentences by the time they're 3. So this is a constructive period where they're building the thing that they're trying to create. So they're building language, they're building movement. They go from no coordinated movement to running, jumping, and skipping by the time they're 3. So what we see from the period between 3 and 6 years old is this is a period of refinement. So this is when the child is taking what they constructed initially and they're going to refine it and make it really, really solid and strong. So in the case of language, we see the child is speaking in sentences by the time they're 3, but they're not understanding the fullness of social language, right? So when adults are talking, they're going to miss a lot of that. If somebody uses sarcasm, they're going to not understand completely what the person was talking about. So they don't understand tone, humor, synonyms. There's a lot of things that's lacking in their language, even though they can speak the language at 3. And so that's what's happening in the 3 to 6 period is they're refining all of that which they constructed before. So that's a really big part of the 3 to 6 timeframe. Within the constructive period, so the 0 to 3 period, there is a second subdivision, which is usually around walking. So we have a subdivision between the infant, the non-walking child, and then the toddler, the walking child, right? So children, when I say walking, I mean walking well. When children initially start walking, they don't immediately abandon crawling. Usually they take a couple of steps and then they start crawling again, because crawling is more efficient. But then as they get more familiar with taking more steps, they start crawling a little less until the child is fully on their feet, and they're walking. And so that's what I'm talking about is the fully on their feet. So even though kids might take their first steps somewhere around a year, where we don't typically see them abandoning crawling for a little while after. So usually by the time the child is 18 months, this is a child who's walking well, they're on their feet, they usually have a handful of words. So the 18 months transition, that's when we're really going to see that as toddlerhood development. And this lasts until about 3 years old. So if we're going to define toddler, it's going to be about 18 months, but really walking well. So it might be a few months before that to about 3 years old. That's going to be the heart of toddlerhood. And so if we think about the child developing themselves, they're building capacity as they go through these stages in their development. And the way that their capacity is going to grow is that they are actually building their foundational capacity in the first 18 months, hence my book. The first 18 months is going to be when the child is doing the most foundational capacity because the newborn is going from no language to words, right? They've built the foundation of the language by the time they're 18 months. They don't speak the language fully. They still have more construction to do. But in terms of capacity, they've built the foundation. In toddlerhood, they're then going to practice using that capacity. They're going to take their few words or they're going to take their capacity to walk and they're going to start using that capacity in a lot of different situations. So they get so much practice in movement and language that by the time they're 3, they are very capable of speaking in sentences and moving their body around as they want to move around. So what happens in the 3 to 6 time is their capacity really shifts and they start shifting into their capacity in the context of their community. You see a lot of social development during the 3 to 6 time, but I'll give you an example of the child learning how to put on their own coat, right? So in the infant stage, 0 to 18 months, the child isn't going to be able to do that, most likely, until they're walking. That's going to be very difficult for them to have the capacity to do that by themselves. They're still building their basic motor skills. They're still doing all the basic things that would allow them to do something like that. Now, toddlerhood, they actually have the capacity, but they're under practiced at it. So they need practice on where do I find the jacket and how do I put it on and how do I sequence my motor skills to actually get it up over my head. So that's what the toddler is working on. And by the time the child is 3, the child can put on their jacket. So the child in their 0 to 3 space is going to be very focused on their individual capacity. So they're going to say, my jacket is on. I have done the task. I feel proud of myself. I put my jacket on. Hooray. But the child in 3 to 6 is starting to be aware that that's not the only capacity that's needed. So they have collaborative capacity that they're really looking at. So a 2.5-year-old is going to get frustrated once they've put on their jacket and they're ready to go to the park. They're going to get frustrated that we're not going to the park yet because little brother doesn't have the jacket on, right? Because somebody else doesn't have their shoes on ready to go. The toddler and the 0 to 3 child is going to be frustrated because they did the work. They're focused on individual capacity. They put on their jacket. So why aren't we going? A 4.5-year-old is going to recognize that the capacity of the community is we all need to be ready in order for us to go to the park, not just you. So it's great that you have your jacket on, but there are other people here. And so, a 4.5-year-old is going to be much more aware of those dynamics to say, oh, yes, I have individual capacity. I put my jacket on, but little brother doesn't have their jacket. So maybe I want to help them, or maybe I want to do this, or I understand that we have to wait a moment before everybody's ready and we can leave for the park. So when we think about the child's perspective, particularly when we think about the child in toddlerhood, is they're going to be really, really focused on their own capacity. So using language with the toddler of saying how they're impacting other people, that it's making me late for work when you don't da da da, that is not helpful to them because that's just not that's not how they view the world. They are just focused on their individual capacity because they're still in a constructive period. They're still building themselves. And so they're not really they don't have the bandwidth to think about everybody else right now in their development because they have to build so much of themselves. But once they move into that social space in 3 to 6, yes, they are starting to think about other people. They are starting to understand that capacity is communal. And it's dependent on individuals being capable, but then the capacity ends up being communal because humans are social creatures. So when we think about the toddler, we also want to recognize that they're trying to use their capacity. They've built some things in the first 18 months, and it's like they've built a really cool sports car and now they have the keys and they kind of want to take it for a spin. That's toddlerhood, right? And they don't know all the road signs and they don't know all the the way that the system works, and they don't know all of that, but they've spent a long time building themselves and they kind of want to use what they've built. And that's how they actually develop capacity. And so what you hear from the toddler, three main things that you're going to hear from the toddler is you're going to hear the word me enter their vocabulary. They are self-aware of being their own independent person. So they start articulating that. They also start articulating I do it, or sometimes me do it. They want to do things themselves because, like the sports car example, they kind of want to take it for a spin. They really want to use the body they've built. They want to use the language they've built. So they really want to do things themselves. And what you see in the toddlers is something that Montessori described as maximum effort, is the toddlers are willing to put in the effort to do the hard work of practicing enough to get them to this really strong capacity by the time they're 3 years old of speaking in sentences and running and skipping and jumping. So they really are trying to launch themselves forward in development by using a ton of practice, and they're willing to put in the effort behind it. So if there's a heavy bag of groceries, it is the toddler who wants to pick it up, even if they can't. That's maximum effort. So that's what's happening in that period of development. And so when we think about order, the question that we want to ask ourselves is, how does order serve this development? So this is the development that is happening regardless of whatever. We don't have to do anything specific, and this is the development that's going to be happening. But how does order serve this development? Why would it be important for the brain and the body to use order to do this? How does order fit in? And that's, of course, what we're talking about. So let's understand order. So the way that I want to understand order is I am going to invite you to imagine that you are going to make a simple meal. This is not a restaurant quality meal. You are literally going to make the most basic meal. And you might feel quite capable of making this basic meal because what you need to be capable of making this basic meal is you need two basic things. You need to be able to move your hands and your body, and you need to be able to understand. Those are the two basics. So either understand a recipe or understand a YouTube tutorial or understand a person who's teaching you how to do the thing. You need to be able to understand the words, whether they be written or verbal. You need to be able to understand what's happening, and then you need to move your body in different ways. And you might encounter a tool that you've never used before, like if you've never grated cheese. But that's just a series of movements you've never done before. But as long as you can move, you can figure out how to do those movements and you just need practice. So even using a whisk, right? That's just a different kind of movement. So as long as you can move your hands and your body, and as long as you can kind of understand some directions, then you're going to be able to make this meal. So let's imagine you're trying to make this meal and you're capable. We've decided that you're capable because you can move and you can understand some basic directions. So you are capable of this, and you are in a kitchen that you are familiar with that is orderly, right? So you have utensils with other utensils in a drawer. You have spices with other spices in a cabinet. You have pots and pans with other pots and pans, right? So there's this order in the kitchen, and you're trying to make the simple dish. How much can you use your capacity to make the dish? Well, probably pretty easily. You would easily make this dish because you're familiar with the order. You know where to get the pot, you know where to get the water, you know which utensils to use and the spices. Everything's available to you. So the environment is not going to be an obstacle to you reaching your capacity. You'll just make the meal. So let's say you wake up tomorrow and you now go down to your kitchen, and the things in the kitchen are still organized in the same way. They've just been moved around. So the pots and pans are still with pots and pans, but they're just in a different location in the kitchen. And your utensils are still with utensils, but they're in a different drawer. It's going to take you some time to orient to where things are as you're trying to make the simple dish. And as you make it, the environment is going to be a slight obstacle to you making your dish because you're not expecting things to be where they are and where you need them to be. But over time, if things kept their order, over time, you would be able to understand, okay, I remember where the utensils are now. And so next time I make the dish, I'm not going to be as slow at making the dish because I'm more familiar with the order. So you can adjust to that order. So now let's imagine the next day you come down and there's limited order in your kitchen, right? So you don't have utensils with utensils. That sometimes some of the utensils are with the mixing bowls, and some of the utensils are in the drying rack, and some of them are in the drawer, but then some of them are also housed with the pots. And then you have a lid from your pot, and that one's in the refrigerator, but the other lid, no, that one's in the cabinet to the left of the stove. Right. And you just kind of go on and on. There's no real order. There's no real categorization. You have the cinnamon with the baking stuff, but then you have the salt over, next to the stove, but then you have the garlic powder. That one's in the refrigerator. Right? Like you have everything all over the place. Right. But you have everything in the same spot day after day after day. So just like somebody with a really messy desk that they're familiar with, you can ask somebody with a messy desk that they're familiar with to find you the stapler, and they'd find it no problem, right? Because they're familiar with the order, but it's not immediately obvious unless you've memorized and had a lot of familiarity with things, because it's not like you have to find the spice area and then now you can find all of the spices. Things are in all different kinds of spaces. You have to remember that the cinnamon is in the baking area. You have to remember that the garlic powder is in the refrigerator. So it's taking a lot of mental energy to remember where everything is. So even if it stays the same and you're able to utilize the space with limited order, your brain is still overworking because you're having to remember very random connections. Random connections like you're going to have to remember that if you need the butter dish, it's near the mixing bowl, right? Like those two things don't necessarily make any sense, but your brain is wanting to connect these two things so that you can use the space to meet the capacity that you have, which is to make this basic dish. But you're an adult. So the way that your brain is going to make these connections between the butter dish and the mixing bowl, your brain is using that in short-term memory. For the time being, you need to remember that those two things go together. But in other spaces, you don't necessarily need to know that, because if you go to somebody else's kitchen, the mixing bowl is not going to be near the butter dish. That's not a repeated connection. So it's a very short-term thing that you're going to have to remember. And kids' brains are different because kids are building the actual architecture of their brain. So the connections that they build are like a brand new city setting up its roadways. So in 50 years, the city is going to be still using that basic architecture. And if it's not built very well, or if it has these random connections that don't go anywhere, it's going to be really hard for the brain to actually use the streets that it's created. So we do want to be mindful that even though an adult brain can make random connections in a short-term way to create order out of mess, the child is actually building the architecture of their brain. So when they create random connections, that is like a street that goes nowhere in the city planning of the beginning city. And if we build the city around that street to nowhere, it's going to become a bigger and bigger headache as we grow and grow the city, which is what's happening in the child's brain. I'll speak a little bit more to the brain connections in a little bit, but I do want to point out that in the scenario of limited order, same spot, while you can adjust to that, for the child's brain, it's not as optimal as order for the child's brain connections, for them to make connections that make more sense than random ones that they have to do just to understand a space that's lacking order. Okay, so let's now assume that you come down to your kitchen and everything is still all over the place. It's a mess, but now the mess has been rearranged. So things are not in the same spot. And then the next day, things are not in the same spot. And we think about that in the sense of capacity. Can you make a dish? And we're going to say, wow, you're going to have a really hard time making a dish if this is the way that your environment is set up, because you won't know how to access the things that you need in order to have your capacity. And this is often how children's spaces are set up, right? They don't know where their belongings are from day to day. They don't know where to find things from day to day. And this is going to be limiting the child's ability to use the environment for their own capacity, because they're not able to get over all the obstacles to their capacity. So when we think about our developmental timeline and the question of how does order serve development, the first one is order is going to help prevent obstacles to capacity, right? So in the first example, if you have an orderly kitchen and things make sense, you're going to make that dish no problem. So the order of the environment has prevented any obstacles to your capacity. Well, the second one is going to be that it aids in the creation of usable connections, which is what I talked about a little bit earlier, but I'll give you another example. So let's think about the brain making connections. So just having the child experiencing things. I don't know if you've ever heard of the phrase, what fires together, wires together. That's the idea that when the brain experiences two things at the same time, it actually creates a connection between those. So it wires those two connections together. So what's happening, let's imagine the child is going to take a bath and we have bath toys. We have a carrot, we have a car, we have a dinosaur. Those things are firing together because they exist together. So the brain is going to be looking for connections between all of these things. But of course, there are no connections, right? There's not connections in the real world where the child is going to repeatedly see cars and dinosaurs in the same situation. There's not connections that the brain is going to see over and over again where there's cars and carrots in the same. And none of these are seen over and over again with water. And so the brain has made these connections because the bath toys and the water fired together, but they're not usable for the brain. These are like the dead end roads in the initial city planning. So what happens in the brain is that when you have these dead end connections, eventually the child in adolescence is going through what's called synaptic pruning, where the brain says, we don't use these. This is a useless connection, so we're going to trim all of those. that takes an incredible amount of effort for the brain to make all these connections and then to trim them all away. It would make more sense when we think about order and categorization to say, okay, well, the bath toys that I'm going to have in the bath are going to be things that are connected with water and that are connected with each other. So that when the child is working, using all of the connections in the brain they've built in the real world, these things just get reinforced and reinforced that there is something about orcas in water and orcas in submarines and orcas in the duck, right? That all of these things can get reinforced over time, which makes the connections that are happening in the brain actually usable. And then we don't have to spend all this effort trimming them away when the child gets to adolescence. So, aiding in the creating of usable connections is a second piece. And the third piece is creating the feeling of safety. So, if we think about the child in an unpredictable world, or yourself in an unpredictable world, when things are not predictable, the child is having to adapt, to adjust, to survey, to predict, to stay alert, to be watchful, to be on guard. The brain is spending a lot of effort to try to understand what's going on when things are different every single day. If they don't know every single day, the toy bin, who knows where my dinosaur is? Could be at the bottom, could be at the top, could be over here. It's really taxing on the brain to live in an unpredictable space. Whereas when the brain has access to predictability, it feels relaxed, things are expected, things feel familiar, they're known, attention can be diffused, it feels calm, it feels normal. And oftentimes the child lives an unpredictable world and the adult has a very predictable world, right? Because you set up your kitchen with the utensils with the utensils. You don't have toilet paper in the cabinet in the kitchen because it doesn't make any sense, right? You don't put your car keys in the refrigerator because it doesn't make any sense. So you live in a predictable world. The child often is living in an unpredictable world, and that is very taxing on their brain and formation. So what we want is the same thing that we do for ourselves. We want to bring the child into the predictable world that we cherish, that we love. And so when we do that, we're giving the child's brain this feeling of safety, and safe brains learn. Brains that don't feel safe can't learn. So safety is going to be the number one thing the brain is focused on. And if the brain doesn't feel safe, it's not going to learn new things. It's only going to try to keep itself safe. Whereas if it feels safe, it can actually learn a thing or two. So let's give an example of the wrong cup. So the child wants water, and you say, here you go, and you give them water in a green cup. And of course, the child melts down and has a total fit. Let's think about this tantrum for just a moment. The child let's imagine that they are thinking that water comes from the pink cup. That's the category they've built in their brain. Water doesn't come from the green cup. This is not about a preference of color. This is about how they've organized and created connections in their brain. So the brain has created a category of which vessel meets this essential need. This is actually a good thing. This is like the brain doing what it's supposed to do. This is the brain using order to understand the world and to understand how to survive here. So what we want for the brain is we want whatever strategy we have to support preventing obstacles, creating usable connections, and feeling safe. So that's what the point of the child creating categories of, I think this cup gives me water and I think this one doesn't. The point is not to make your life harder. The point is the brain is trying to do these three things. So let's think about how we might respond to the child. So one way we could respond is we can say, okay, which cup do you want? Right? And the cup that we choose could be the pink one because we know that that's the one that we want. So let's think about, is this actually going to help prevent obstacles, create usable connections, and feel safe? Well, the problem with giving them the pink cup is we're reinforcing that pink cups give water, which is sort of true, but that's not the critical piece that the child should be paying attention to. It's vessels give water, right? They don't have to be pink. So for the child to feel safe, if there's no pink cups around, their brain is going to say, oh my God, I might not have any water, right? And that's not going to help to reinforce the narrow view that the child has and the narrow connections they've made about this cup. So alternately, we could say, okay, No, we're not going to give them the pink cup. I gave you the green cup. It's got water. You've got to learn you can use this cup or not have any water. That could be our reaction. So let's think about that one. Well, if the child continues to have a fit, which they probably will, they may not drink water out of the green cup, which is going to reinforce that water doesn't come from green cups, right? That's going to be a problem because we're not creating any additional usable connections. We're reinforcing their same narrow sense of order of pink cups are the only ones that give water. The other one that I think is problematic here is the feeling of safety, right? It's introducing this idea that my caregiver might withhold something essential to life, right? If I'm not compliant. And that's really scary that I might not get water, which is essential to life, if I don't sort of follow what you're saying and that you're the one doing that. So now I feel a little insecurity around you. I'm not going to feel 100% safe because I feel like, wow, you're willing to withhold something essential for me that I need for my life that you are going to withhold. That's a really scary idea. So that's not going to help make the child feel safe. And so then the question, of course, is like, well, then what do we do? And so this is where I want to point out that we go in terms of Montessori, we go to the developmental timeline. So this is where we say, okay, so the child we know in toddlerhood, they are trying to use capacity. They are thinking about individual capacity, their own capacity. They want to do things themselves and they're willing to put in the effort to do it. So what might that look like in order to set up a situation where the child is their development is going to be honored in this way? Can be a simple water station, right? A low table, some kind of water source, cups, and a wastewater bucket, right? In this situation, when the child wants water, they can get water and therefore they don't have any obstacles to capacity because they're able to just access the water. They will be able to create usable connections because it doesn't matter which cup they take, they can fill it with water and see that all the cups give water. And it also creates a feeling of safety because they can access water when they like. The other option is the child doesn't get water because they don't understand how to do this. And then we can just show them, right? And when we show them, this gives them all the benefits of what their brain is after. And it often makes them feel calm and safe and secure and self confident when we set things up in this way. An alternative would be to have a low shelf where there's a cup available or cups available and then a step stool to a sink. So you can set it up in lots of different ways, but the idea is that we're thinking from the perspective of the toddler. How can they have agency? How can they use their environment and understand where things are? And if their cups are going to be in the cupboard, then they're going to be in the cupboard every day and they're going to be in the same spot every day. So they don't have to go looking around the kitchen to try to figure out how am I going to meet this need? So the last piece before we get to our Q&A is implementing order. And there's 4 recommendations that I have to implement order. The first is categorization. So you saw this when we were talking about the making connections in the brain. This is also from the kitchen example. Kitchens are great examples of adults creating categories and categories within categories. All of that work to create categories within categories is creating usability in the space. It allows you to function. It allows you to meet your capacity in that space. Same thing for kids. So categories are really helpful. The second one is accessibility, right? This is the wrong cup example, that when the child has access to the order that's presented, oh, that's where the cups are. I can orient to knowing I know exactly where the water station is, or I know where the cups are because things are visible and accessible to me. So I can actually use the order to meet my needs. The next one is sequence. So if we think the example of the water station, if the child turns on the water spigot before getting a cup, right, that sequence doesn't work. They need to get the cup first and then fill the water. So when the child is encouraged to participate in a logical sequence of events, it aids them in understanding how to build their capacity because then they're going to do things in the right order. And the last one is temporal order, right? So this is the routines of the day. This is what their body is going to expect day in and day out as they move through their day. And I have 2 short videos and then we're going to do our Q&A. But I like this video because this is going to show the impact of capacity on categorization and accessibility. So this is the video that I wanted to show. So as an example of the impact of categorization and accessibility, that's what this video is going to show. And so when you're thinking about the impact, what I want you to think about is capacity. So thinking about the impact on the child's capacity on having a space that is accessible and having a space that has categories. The other thing I want to point out about this video, this is a child who's 15 months. So I like this video because I think it helps remind us that we think we're being clear, and how when the child is still in the formation of language, under 3 years old, they're not getting everything we're saying. So you'll see in this video that I say something like, you can put your clothes in the drawer, and the child hears, close the drawer. And so then she closes the drawer. But I'm trying to tell her to clean up her room by putting clothes in a drawer, right? So I also say something along the lines of, your clothes are on the floor. And that sounds a whole lot like drawer also. So when we're thinking about language, we have to remember that the child who's still in construction of language is not going to fully understand everything that we're saying. So think about how accessibility and order is supporting this child at 15 months, but also pay attention to the language that's being used to see how the child is supported. Yeah, put your clothes away. There's more clothes on the floor. Yeah, look at your shirt. Your shirt is on the floor. Shirt on the floor, Selena. Shirt floor. Put your shirt in the drawer. Selena, I'm going to show you. Stand up. So you. This shirt can go in this drawer. The shirt is in the drawer. Let's do this one. The shirt is in the drawer. Let's do this one. That's a skirt. That can go in the drawer too. And one more. One more shirt. It's behind you. Now we can close the drawer. Last thing, the dog. Let's put the dog away. Selena, your room is clean. Let's go. Okay, so that's one. And then the other one I wanted to show you was around sequence. And this one, just trying to see which one it was. Here it is. So this is to point out sequence. So I want you to pay attention to sequence and temporal order. So these two sort of recommendations of how do these really fit together in terms of how the child learns doing one thing to another to another. This is a child who's almost 18 months and does not have very much language. So this is a child, you'll hear the only reason I can understand is because I'm with the child all the time as mom, but you can hear the child only has little bits of the beginnings of words. And so this is a child who does not have a lot of language, but you can still see the sequence that is being offered to the child. No, honey, you're happy. You have bread. Yep, you've got your bread on a plate. Yeah, the bread, you can eat that. No, you don't have to. Oh, after you eat that, if you'd like more sandwich, I can give you more. Mm-hmm. Your choice. Yeah, eat more. Go ahead. Yeah, we really meat all. You ate more. Yeah, chew, chew, and swallow, and then you can have some more. Chew, chew, and swallow. Yum, 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 yum. Do you need some water? Some water? Yeah. You want your napkin? You go. Yeah. Sticky fingers, huh? Yeah, hand. You've got sticky fingers in your hand. Feeling better? A little bit more clean? Do you want more sandwich now? Yeah. Here we go. Okay. So the videos were meant to represent sort of using those things, but obviously I know you all have questions. It's nice to see so many people from all over. And I can't wait to talk about scenarios, to talk about order. And yeah, I'm excited to get started with our Q&A.
Perfect. I already saw one question in the chat, so I will start with that before other questions come. Then we can go to the questions that people were sending during the registration. Okay. Hello, I am a parent to two boys, 5 and 2. Do you have experience how to create order for PDA autistic boy, 5 years?
I mean, I think that the basics apply, right? That, children with a variety of different sort of neurodivergence, they might need things more orderly, or they might need a little bit more flexibility to the order. So it sort of depends on what you know about your child, but everybody's brain might need just a little bit more order or a little bit more flexibility for the order. I know one of my kids has ADHD and needs a little bit more flexibility with the order and routine. It's very hard, but I've also had kids who've been on the spectrum, who've needed much more order, right, than my kid who needs a little bit more flexibility around the edges. So I think it's helpful to know your kid, but generally, order is going to give us predictability. Order is going to give us all of these really helpful tools to just use our environment. And so that would still apply. And for a 2 and a 5-year-old, this is a age bracket where the child is starting to be more in that sort of second phase of development, right? So in 6 months, when the 2-year-old is 2.5, they're going to be edging into that second phase. And the older one is already in that second phase. So what can often happen just generally with a 2 and a 5-year-old is the 2-year-old being the younger one. Sometimes we do things for them just to make the day go faster, and that maybe the older one had the ability to do on their own when they were 2, but the younger one tends to go along with the ride. What tends to happen is around 3, we start saying, all right, I think you can do your shoes. And the child doesn't say, I do it anymore. They say, you do it, right? They put it right back on you. Whereas the true toddler is going to always say, I do it. They're always going to want to do it themselves. But there's a transition. If we've been doing things for the child somewhere around 2.5 to 3.5 is going to start throwing the shoes back at you and saying, no, you do my shoes, right? Because they're not thinking about themselves anymore, right? They're like, collaborative capacity here, guys. Like we all need to get out the door, so it's easier for you to just put my shoes on. So let's go. They're not thinking about themselves. So I would say generally we really want to make sure that before the child is 3 years old, before they really start mentally shifting to thinking about others, over themselves. We really want to take advantage of slowing down, giving them the opportunity to do the things, and giving them a space where they're going to be able to do it. Right. So if we want them to do their shoes, we need to give them access to their shoes. We need to think about how complicated the shoes are. We need to give them time to practice those shoes. All those things are going to be during that constructive period that are going to be really, really important. But in terms of knowing your specific kid, I would say that in neurodivergence is sometimes you need to have the order real clear, and that's really helpful to the child. And sometimes you need to be a little bit more flexible. But it's all within the same basic principle of we all benefit from an orderly environment because we can just simply function better in it.
Perfect. Another one. My toddler is turning 4 in a month. I follow routine, but I'm challenged with getting the child to stay and focus in classes. The child refuses to focus or even stay in the class.
Yeah. So what I would say is developmentally that toddlerhood is really going to wrap up by the time the child is 3. So when we think about toddler, we're thinking about that unstable walking child. So toddlers, up until they're 3 are usually still toddling. They're walking, but they can fall at any moment. Whereas after 3, this is a child who's much more stable on their feet, and developmentally, they're in a really different space. So just to sort of say that the 4-year-old or an almost 4-year-old, they well out of toddler range. So after 3, they're really not toddlers anymore. But in terms of having the child stay in a space, right? I think it depends so much on what's going on in that space. So in Montessori spaces, yes, of course, there are some basic guidelines that you need to sort of stay in the space, but there's a tremendous amount of freedom. So if the child's really wanting to move, there's lots of opportunities to give the child to be able to move around. And usually that's what we want to take from the observation. So if the child tries to leave, the leaving is not necessarily the important part of the observation. The movement is. So what is it about the movement and the agency, right? It's not, I want to be out of the space. It's, I want to move and I want agency of my movements. I want to decide where I go. And it's like, great, you can do that within this parameters. But in Montessori environments, that's why we put in the environment, there's so many different options and choices and movements and things that they can do within the basic parameters of, and, especially if you're in a school setting, a kid can't just walk out the front door. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I did want to clarify just what we mean by toddler developmentally. Even if linguistically people tend to use it for older children, we're developmentally really going to think about that child from walking well to 3 years old, and then utilizing our observations of what they're doing to inform, oh, you want more agency, you want more choice, you want more movement. That's what we would infuse in the environment.
Question from Amina. My 2-year-old daughter sometimes throws toys off the table or food on the floor when she doesn't like it. Recently, she has started putting toys back on the shelf, but occasionally throws everything off the shelf too. Is this behavior normal for her age? How can I guide her to handle toys and food appropriately without making her feel frustrated?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it's going to, during the constructive period, all of these things are going to be normal because they're practicing all kinds of things, right? They don't know all the road signs. They've been given keys to the Mercedes and they're going to take it for a spin. So all of these things are normal for the child to be trying on and practicing and seeing what happens. So much of order is cause and effect of well, what how do I sequence and understand, I can't get the water if I didn't get the cup first. It's well, also, what happens if I drop the thing? I'd say that sometimes in terms of how the child is interacting with the environment, let's say for toys, is if the child is using something let's say a truck, and them dropping it off the shelf is potentially going to break the truck, right? What is it about dropping that we can give the child that might be more interesting that they can drop all they want, right? That the issue is not necessarily the motor practice because we expect that developmentally. The issue is the thing that they're using that's not appropriate for that motor practice, right? So we don't want them to drop a glass vase, but could they drop a bean bag? Right? Of course, we wouldn't have any problem with that. Could they drop a ball? Of course, we wouldn't have any problem with that. So consider what's in the environment. If the child is showing interest in a specific skill, like dropping things, that's a skill. It's just as much of a skill to pick things up, but you also sometimes need to let them go. So if the child is actually interested in that, give them things that they would be allowed to drop. And then the idea would be that you're allowed to use this so long as when you're done doing that dropping thing, you're willing to put it back. And if you're not willing to put it back, and this is not what I'm saying to the child, this is just in my head. If the child is unwilling to put it back, then it doesn't need to be on the shelf, right? And very soon the child's going to realize, oh, if I want to play the dropping game, which is what I want to do, the only way I get to continue playing the dropping game is if I put the simple thing on the shelf. So we can pare down, if you have 16 balls available to the child and they're throwing them all over the place and they can't clean them up, then don't give them 16 balls, give them one. And then usually if it's an interesting thing for them to do, then they will be willing to just put that one back on the shelf when they're done with their game. In terms of the food, I would say often what I would say about the food one is that usually children who are hungry, when there's food in front of them, they want to eat it because they are hungry. It's usually at the end of the meal when the child isn't hungry anymore that they start messing around with the food, like dropping it or doing other things. And it's possible they're just trying to communicate that they're not hungry. And so I would consider, are there signals before then that told you that they were kind of wrapping up food? And so we can maybe wrap things up so that we're not continually giving them food when they've already given us some signals that they're not hungry anymore. And now we're just giving them fodder to just drop. That often there's a point that you could end the meal earlier, not as a punishment, but just have a pleasant end to the meal where you don't bring them into the space where they're now playing with the food because they're simply not hungry. So that's what I would say about the food one, is that it's probably the meal should have ended maybe 3 minutes earlier.
I will go to Sharon. My 3.5 years old has finally found out where I store his toys that I rotate for him. He often says he doesn't like the toys on the shelf and he wants XY, and instead. I used to be able to say, okay, something along the line that you stay here and I will get it for you. These days, he wants to go to the storage to get the toys or material he wants. Should I then organize the storage room so he can access the toys by himself or continue to rotate toys on his shelf? I'm doing both now, but I noticed that he is not playing as well when he just takes a random toy from the storage that he insists that he was looking for this for a long time. I want to add that he does put the toys back to the storage room by himself.
So it sort of depends on how you want to set up your environment. If you want as long as the child is putting it away, right? Then we wonder, like, what is the issue? So, and I want to address the idea of toy rotation. So Montessori actually, I don't know where toy rotation and Montessori started merging, but they're not actually part of the same field. So toy rotation is sort of the opposite of what we're trying to do in Montessori. In Montessori, we're trying to create predictability and stability in the environment, right? We're trying to have things the same. And that's what people will say, is they'll come back to their Montessori preschool classroom 20 years later and it'll look the same. That's sort of the idea, is that things are going to be relatively the same, because just like your kitchen, you don't want that constantly moved around and be like, well, now I don't have these utensils. Now you have these and they're different. That's not helpful to when you are trying to construct yourself. And so in Montessori, we're trying for predictability. So if the child is willing to put things away, I would wonder, can the storage closet not be seen as the storage closet? Can that just be accessible to them? And that's just one place where they can find activities to do, so that it's all just generally accessible. The only time you're going to put things in storage is if they can't handle the quantity that you've put out, because they're unwilling to put it away. So if you give them 150 magnet tiles and they are only willing to put away 5, then tomorrow there should only be 5 Magnetos on the shelf, right? Because they exhausted themselves. They were not able to meet their capacity because that was too much to try to put away. So we're trying to give them something they can actually handle. But if the child just wants a wider selection and they're willing to put things away, then there's no issue. Maybe take it out of the storage closet and add another shelf if the child's willing to be responsible. But the use of the storage shelf is about trying to reduce clutter so that the child can be more successful, not to sort of like be switching toys out for renewed interest. The point is that we're trying to stabilize the environment, have a variety of things that might be available and interesting to this developmental age, and then you make tiny little tweaks along the way, like maybe adding, I think you can do more than 5 Magnetos. We can go up to 10. Or you're throwing the trucks. So I can't have trucks here, so I'm going to give you things that can throw. But that's a very specific design of the environment. It's not, here's how I'm going to change this up all the time so that you are interested in your toys, right? For a long time, kids with a cardboard box could play for 3 hours, right? So kids don't need, they will find interesting things to do with their time. They don't need us to create that interest for them, is what I would say.
Thanks. I have a question from Mina. My 2-year-old refuses to wear a diaper or listen to what we try to tell him, like basically he's rebelling against everything and he wants things his way.
I mean, I would think about the process of listening. So in the video with the child and the chest of drawers, right? I was saying, I said something like, the shirt is on the floor, and my child went to the drawer and made sure that a shirt was taken out of the drawer and put it on the floor, right? So you can understand that from the child's perspective, that was listening. That was like, I'm trying to put that into my body, but I'm getting it wrong over and over because you're not completely understanding all the language. So in a constructive period from 0 to 3, we have to remember that listening, the child has to process the words that you've said correctly understand them, and then has to send those messages to their body to then enact something. And that process is going to get lost 9 times out of 10. So for the under 3 child, listening is not going to be as effective as what you saw in the video with the drawers of me getting up and demonstrating. I'm saying this goes here, and I've got a smile on my face, right? Like I'm trying not to communicate. I'm mad at you. I'm frustrated. I am understanding that you're not understanding what I'm trying to say. And so I'm going to demonstrate this goes here, right? And either the child does it or they don't do it. But there's likely things that if the child melted down and they were like, I don't want anything to do with that, then I would model further. I would say, oh, look, I found the skirt. I'm going to put the skirt in the drawer and see if the child will pick up the next one. And if they really don't, I'm going to start wondering, like, are you hungry? Is it almost time for nap? Like, what is going on here that's beyond what's happening? Because when given an opportunity, the toddler wants to do things themselves. So if you give them an opportunity to do it themselves, they're going to usually want to do it. So if they're not doing it, even though being given the opportunity to do it themselves, my question starts to become, did you understand it? Or is there something else happening here where there's some other need that's not getting met that I'm not aware of? And that's much, much more likely to be happening than pure defiance. That the child is not defying you under 3. They're usually misunderstanding, or they're just thinking about themselves, which is fine. But we want to channel that self-thought into what they're supposed to do. So they're like, I decide I don't want to wear the diaper, right? And you're like, great, then you can sit on the potty. Then do that then, right? So I'm channeling their defiance, quote unquote, into, you are saying you want to do this yourself. Great. The diaper means that I'm doing this for you. So if you want to do it yourself, right? The same thing with toothbrushing. If they refuse to brush their teeth, great, then I'm going to brush their teeth. They're not going to like that, right? So then you say, great, then you do it. And so all of a sudden, when you say you can do this to a toddler, usually the child is like, well, give me that toothbrush, I'll show you. And then you don't do it for me. So usually we just want to keep tracking them into how can I take your advocacy for yourself and channel it into you doing the things that I know developmentally you would like to be doing, which is all these things for yourself. But I definitely 2-year-old, great time to be doing toileting. So if the child doesn't want a diaper, great sign that they are trying to tell you something, that they don't want a diaper, that they want to move on.
Perfect. Eva is saying that she has submitted question before and I found it. So I'm going to read it. My 19-month-old toddler loves routines, and we support this as much as possible. How can we best address situations where her desire for something to happen isn't in her best interest? Example, after refusing to wear shoes, she now loves them because they mean she gets to walk outside. Now she doesn't want to take them off and cries when we change her or when she has to take them off for naps and bedtime.
Mhm. Yeah. So that's a great question, a really good scenario. So I would think, what is the child? The child has created a connection between outdoor shoes and going outside, and they love going outside. So that's the connection. So when the child refuses to take off the shoes at nap time, it's because of that connection that they have erroneously connected. If I'm not wearing the shoes, that means I can't go outside, right? Like that's not, it's almost right, but it's like that's not quite what that's not quite the usable connection. That's like the giving the child the pink cup. It's like, well, we're sort of reinforcing the wrong idea that green cups don't give water, right? And so we want to allow the child through the routines of the space. So if when you come in from outside, if the routine of the space is to take off shoes, then we are going to take off shoes. It's important to the sequence. Like from the second video, I wasn't going to give more sandwich before the child had finished the current sandwich. So that's just like the sequence that I want to support in terms of the order and routine of how things happen. So if when you come home, the outdoor shoes come off, we want to make sure the outdoor shoes come off. But then this is no longer about their construct of they don't believe they're going to go outside. This is now about you get to do this thing. I'd say, okay, so we're going to take the boots off. Do you want to take off this boot or this boot? Right? We're putting agency back with the child. We're saying you get to do something right now. Would you like to put your shoes on the shelf or in the cupboard or the shoe cupboard or whatever? But we're not going to get lost in the child's connection. They're very, very minimal connection of shoes mean I get to go outside. We're going to just keep focusing on the routine. The order is that when we come through the door, the first thing we do is take off shoes. And you can do it or I can do it, but they're going to come off. And the more routine that you make that, the more the child will stop second guessing it, because it just is what happens. And it's just already what happens. And we just sort of move on through. Uh, and that allows that when you're going to nap, you don't have this big shoe battle because the shoes are already off. So I think that that's helpful. A lot of people have shoes off homes, but if you don't have a shoes off home, obviously that might be a battle that you have at bedtime. But then that becomes a limit that you say no shoes in the bed, right? If you have shoes on in the home, you might have some boundaries that say, well, but there's no shoes on the couch and there's no shoes in the bed. Right. And then those are the point at which you want to set those limits is at the point of the couch or the bed. I think it's easier to just take the shoes off at the door. But it depends on your family style and your family home. So if you'd like to have that battle at the couch and the bed, then that is where you're gonna take these off, and then you just kind of are gonna get them to the other side of this, and then they might have a meltdown, and that's okay. But in their body, the shoes are off. So in their body, they've learned that's the part of the routine, is that we don't put shoes in the bed. And so we understand the child's logic, but we don't want to follow them down the rabbit hole of their logic, because in the example of the green and the pink cup, that is they've learned something. Water comes from pink cups, but they're taking it the wrong way, where water only comes from pink cups, right? And so we want to help expand them by focusing on here's what you get to do, here's what you can do, here's the choices that you have. If you're not going to do that, then I am going to move you through the routine.
The question comes from CJ from the registration forms. How can I tell my family this need for a routine without seeming too absorbed in my toddler? They think I'm coding him when I make sure all the family activities revolve around a schedule for the 18-month-old and have since he was 6 months old.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this can be hard. I think that it can be really helpful to know that you have brain science on your side, right? So if somebody says, my 18-month-old dropped their nap, and you're like, I have brain science on my side. Kids at this age still need to sleep, right? That you wouldn't say, okay, well then let's drop the nap, right? You're going to protect your child's health and well-being during this critical stage of development. And so part of protecting their health and well-being is protecting their routine, because their routine is what's going to make them feel safe. It's also going to make sure that they meet their basic needs. So you are going to have more flexibility on that when the child is 3 to 6. So because this is when the child is often dropping their nap, somewhere around 4-ish. It's also, they're not going to completely fall apart if their nap is like an hour late, right? It's not going to be the worst thing in the world. But in the period of construction, 0 to 3, the child really thrives on the predictability because they're not planning ahead and understanding what's going on in their world. The 3 to 6-year-old understands, oh, grandma's coming on Saturday. They understand that Saturday's not today. The 2-year-old has no idea. So the 2-year-old cannot understand and have as much flexibility. So I would just think of it from the fact of like, they don't have to like it, but you are going to make sure that you're protecting the health and well-being of your child. And I don't think that the routine. I would suggest, in terms of daily routine, that it's not meant to be like by the minute, that okay, we're going to do this for 45 minutes and then we're going to do art for 30 minutes. That's not a helpful routine. That is not connected to their development. What is connected to their development is they wake up and they're going to have some thing that they need to do after waking up, like changing their clothes and using the bathroom and brushing their teeth and sort of getting ready for the day. That is a normal thing that we do when we wake up. And that is something we want to do with the child. Then there's going to be some kind of meal time often. So then we're going to have some kind of meal time. And then there's this stretch until the next meal time and nap. Right. And so that's how I would think about the routine of the day, is that we're not actually specifying, you know, in tiny details of 10-minute schedules. It's really looser. It's like for the other families, it's like, well, you also had to wake up and do your teeth and change and so the child has to do that too. And you also had breakfast. And so that's what we did. And then, yes, midday, we're going to have lunch. And then my kid needs to nap. And I'm going to protect that because I realize how important sleep is to development. And then when we get up from nap, then we have another stretch where I have a lot of flexibility until it's dinner time. And then, of course, there's bedtime because the child, again, sleep is really important. So I would think of like not granular routine. I would think like broad routine. And usually it's really hard to argue with that. From the outside perspective, if somebody says, "Oh, come on, why can't you come to dinner? We're going to have dinner at 8:30," and you're like, I am gonna say no, but maybe you guys could come over to me and we can have dinner because baby goes to sleep or the toddler goes to sleep at 7:30 or whatever it is, that you can figure out a way that to make that work or not for a little bit. But that's how I would think, is that you are protecting the child during the most critical period of their development. Sleep is essential to their development. And so a lot of routine protection is around sleep, but I wouldn't get granular in terms of like we have to do all these different little things. Those are not as important as the macro routine.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for all of the answers. I also want to say sorry that I didn't read the questions about toilet learning, special needs, and all of the other questions that didn't fit within our topic today because it would get just too broad and we would be here for another 2 or 3 hours. So, thanks to everyone who was here today. At one point, we were around 150 people, which is really nice. Thanks to Mariana for making the time to be here today, to answering all of the questions, doing such a nice presentation. Mariana, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for being here again.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks everybody for your questions and participation.